In the early winter of 1938, when the skies above northern Michigan carried the weight of snow yet to fall, a small town on the edge of Lake Huron woke to silence. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful morning, but the kind that presses against your chest, the kind that makes you aware something is wrong. The Brannons, a family of 5, hadn't been seen in days. Their house stood on the outskirts of Alpena, a narrow wooden structure with boarded windows and a chimney that hadn't breathed smoke since the previous week. For most people, that wouldn't have meant much. But in this town, where neighbors checked on each other and doors were rarely locked, the absence of movement was impossible to ignore. The milk bottles left at the front step had frozen solid. The local postman, a man named Walter Hensley, noticed the week's letters still wedged in the mailbox. He said later that when he approached the porch, the boards beneath him gave a soft groan and a draft seeped from the cracks, cold, sharp, and carrying the faint smell of something metallic. He didn't linger. By afternoon, a deputy had been sent to investigate. When Sheriff Thomas Avery and 2 men from the county office pried open the front door, the air that spilled out was stale and heavy, as if sealed for years. The lamps were off, the curtains drawn tight. Every piece of furniture was in its place. A half-finished meal sat on the table, potatoes gone gray, a roast congealed in its own fat. The clock on the wall had stopped at 9:46, but there were no people, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow leading away, only silence and that faint, unplaceable scent, like iron and ash. The Brannons were known in Alpena not for wealth or scandal, but for their quiet lives. Harold Brannon was a sawmill foreman. His wife Eliza volunteered at the church. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, aged between 6 and 12. Their house had been built by Harold's father at the turn of the century, its timber walls lined with thick birch and a basement carved directly into the frozen earth. People said the place never truly warmed, no matter how high the fire burned. When word of the disappearance spread, the town gathered outside the sealed house. Snow had started to fall, dusting the roof and the abandoned truck parked by the barn. Some whispered that the family must have left suddenly, fleeing debt or shame. Others muttered about sickness, something contagious that forced them to isolate. But the truth, as the sheriff would discover, didn't fit into any of those explanations. The Brannons hadn't run. They hadn't been taken. They had somehow vanished inside their own home. That night, a search party scoured the nearby woods, the frozen river, even the train tracks that cut across the valley. They found nothing. The next morning, one of the volunteers, a farmhand named Russell Pike, noticed something odd on the north wall of the house. A faint, uneven line of frost ran vertically along the siding, as though moisture had seeped from inside. When he pressed his hand against it, he swore he heard a low hum, like the vibration of distant machinery buried beneath the floor. Rumors grew fast in places like Alpena. Some said the Brannons were part of a government experiment gone wrong. Others insisted the family had been cursed, that Harold had unearthed something at the mill, something he should have left buried. There were even those who claimed to have seen a faint light flicker in the windows at night, though the house had been officially sealed by authorities. A week later, investigators from Lansing arrived. They examined the property, took photographs, and left without comment. Whatever they found, they never shared it with the town. The house was boarded up completely, the windows nailed shut from the outside, and a sign was posted, "Property of the state of Michigan. Do not enter." But the strangest part came months later when the snow melted. A local boy, exploring the woods behind the property, found something half buried near a cluster of birch trees, a porcelain teacup cracked clean in half, with traces of soot along the rim. Forensic testing in the 1940s was limited, but the report that surfaced years later mentioned microscopic residues, organic but unidentifiable. The cup was labeled Evidence 12B and quietly shelved. No arrests were made. No bodies were found. Today, the Brannon house still stands, though most of it has sunk into the earth. Locals call it the sealed house. The original foundation remains beneath layers of ivy and rot, the doors fused by time. And those who walk by claim they can still hear faint knocks from within, steady, deliberate, like someone tapping from behind a wall. What happened in that house has been told and retold for generations, but never with answers. The official record lists the case as family disappearance, unresolved. But if you ask the older residents, they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you that the Brannons never truly left, that the house itself refused to let them go, and perhaps that's why, even now, in the dead of winter, when the lake freezes over and the wind cuts through the pines, the townspeople still cross the street before passing that property, not out of fear of ghosts, but out of quiet respect for the unknown. Because whatever happened inside those walls wasn't simply a disappearance, it was an erasure, sealed into the wood and soil of Michigan itself. To understand the story of the Brannon family, we need to step back into Michigan in the late 1930s, a time when the Great Depression still lingered like a slow gray fog over the American Midwest. It was a decade defined by hardship and quiet endurance. People in towns like Alpena were used to working with their hands, building, mending, harvesting, and hoping. Money was short, but pride was not. They found dignity in survival. Alpena, tucked near the northeastern shoreline of Michigan, had always been a town of timber and sweat. The forests surrounding it stretched for miles, dense pines, birch, and maple, feeding the sawmills that kept the local economy alive. The air smelled of resin and damp soil. On most mornings, the hum of machinery and the steady rhythm of axes striking wood echoed through the valley. In winter, that sound dimmed, replaced by the slow creak of frozen trees and the steady crunch of boots on snow. The Brannons were part of that rhythm. Harold Brannon, born in 1898, was a second-generation mill worker. His father had helped build the first railway spur connecting Alpena's lumber yards to the Detroit line. Harold's life followed the same track. Early mornings, calloused hands, the heavy scent of sawdust in his hair. He wasn't ambitious in a worldly sense. He worked hard, paid his debts, and kept to himself. His wife, Eliza, came from a small farming family south of town. People described her as patient, devoted, with a voice that carried softly but firmly through the church choir. They represented the kind of family the Depression had tested but not broken. Michigan in 1938 was a study in contrasts. Detroit, 200 miles south, was pulsing with the noise of industry. Ford's assembly lines, the rise of new technologies, and the uneasy promise of progress. But places like Alpena remained rooted in older rhythms. Electric light was still a novelty in some rural homes. Radios were prized possessions that neighbors would gather around on Sundays. Science and superstition often coexisted. People talked about magnetic storms and strange northern lights with the same seriousness as they did the economy or crops. In those years, isolation was more than a feeling. It was geography. Snow could cut a town off for weeks, roads were often impassable, and telephones unreliable. A house like the Brannons, set back from the main road, could feel like an island when the winter deepened. Families relied on each other and on faith. When things went wrong, help might take days to arrive. This isolation shaped the culture in ways that are hard to imagine today. Fear didn't always come from monsters or crimes. It came from silence, the kind that settled over a frozen lake, or the kind that filled a home when the wind stopped and the fire died. People told stories to make sense of that quiet. They believed in signs, in luck, in the lingering presence of the dead. It wasn't superstition to them, it was survival. By 1938, Michigan's lumber industry was slowing. Many mills had closed, and men like Harold found themselves working longer hours for smaller pay. There were reports of accidents, machines misfiring, logs slipping, and men crushed beneath fallen timber. Some said the forests were reclaiming what had been taken from them, that the land was turning against the people who stripped it bare. For the Brannons, that shift may have been the beginning of unease. Historical records show that Harold's mill experienced several unexplained incidents that year. Tools went missing. A pulley system snapped and nearly killed a worker. The foreman, at the time, wrote in his log, "The men say they hear knocking from under the floor when the machines stop. I think it's the pipes, but it makes them nervous." It's easy to dismiss such details now, but to those who worked 12-hour days in dim, vibrating rooms, sounds took on meanings. A knock could be a warning or a message. The late 1930s also brought a wave of scientific curiosity mixed with fear. Newspapers ran stories about radium, magnetism, and invisible energies. In Michigan, There was particular interest in underground vibrations, small tremors linked to shifting groundwater and the thawing of permafrost. Some locals believed these tremors could cause hallucinations or sickness. Others claimed they disturbed sleep, made clocks stop, and turned milk sour. None of it was proven, but the rumors gave shape to what people already felt, that something unseen was stirring beneath their land. At the same time, there was a cultural silence surrounding mental health. Depression, anxiety, or paranoia were rarely named. People spoke instead of nerves, bad dreams, or a house that won't rest easy. It's within that atmosphere that the Brannans lived, a family bound by habit, hemmed in by work, and surrounded by beliefs that blurred the line between science and fear. Local archives describe the family's neighborhood as a small cluster of homes near the old river route, about 3 miles from the town center. The area had been settled by lumbermen decades earlier, and most of the houses shared the same layout: narrow rooms, steep staircases, and deep basements used for storing coal and root vegetables. Over time, those basements became colder and damper, the earth pressing inward. People said you could hear the walls breathing when the frost shifted. Culturally, this period was a crossroads. America was moving forward, talking about progress, invention, the promise of modernity. But towns like Alpena clung to the old ways. Church attendance remained high. Local traditions persisted: winter gatherings, barn dances, and storytelling around stoves. It was a world caught between faith and fear, reason and rumor. And within that tension, stories of hauntings or disappearances weren't entertainment, they were warnings. If you ask historians today what might have contributed to the Brannan mystery, they might point to environmental isolation, psychological stress, or even industrial contamination. In the 1930s, few understood how prolonged exposure to certain chemicals like carbon monoxide or formaldehyde from sawmill operations could affect the brain. Workers reported dizziness, confusion, and vivid dreams. But in that era, such symptoms were often dismissed as fatigue. When viewed through that lens, the disappearance of the Brannans seems less like a single event and more like the endpoint of gradual decay, a house, a family, and a community quietly eroded by the world around them. By late 1938, Alpena's mood was uneasy. The nights grew longer, and strange noises in the woods were common talk. Some blamed coyotes, others the wind. But as December approached and the Brannan house fell silent, those stories began to take on new meaning. The town had weathered deaths, accidents, and even fires, but never a family simply gone. When newspapers later tried to piece together the family's history, they found gaps: birth certificates missing, records smudged, photographs undeveloped. It was as if the Brannans had been present just long enough to be remembered, then erased. And in the context of that era, where fear and faith were neighbors, that absence felt almost supernatural. The Michigan of 1938 wasn't a place of fast answers or advanced investigation. It was a place where people trusted what they saw and feared what they couldn't explain. So when the sheriff sealed that house, when the government stepped in and said nothing more, the silence became the explanation. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. In a world struggling toward modernity, one family's disappearance reminded people that mystery still ruled the corners of the map, that there were still houses where time could stop, and no one would ever know why. By the first week of December 1938, Alpena was buried under a thick silence that seemed heavier than the snow covering its rooftops. The Brannan house stood alone at the edge of the woods, a narrow wooden frame swallowed by frost. From the road, nothing appeared strange. No smoke, no footprints, no movement. But those who knew the family felt the absence like a held breath. Inside that stillness, something had already begun to unravel. It likely started in the basement. Harold Brannan had been working on a furnace he'd built from salvaged mill parts, proud of his handiwork, though the neighbors thought it odd he worked after dark. One night, a faint orange glow pulsed through the cracks of the cellar windows, too steady to be a fire and too dim to be lamplight. Mrs. Caldwell, who lived across the field, saw it flicker, but told no one. That same night, Harold was in the basement when he heard a tapping somewhere behind the wall. He assumed it was just the pipes cooling, until he realized the sound was hollow. like knuckles against wood. When he struck the wall in return, the sound stopped, only to answer back with 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The next day, Eliza began a letter to her sister in Detroit. She mentioned the cold, the children's cough, and how Harold had been hearing things again. The letter was never sent. When investigators later entered the house, they found it beneath a loose floorboard in the parlor, the ink frozen mid-sentence. Their eldest son, Robert, had also begun to complain about the cellar. He told a friend that, "The air hums down there like it's alive." The teacher dismissed it as childish fancy. Yet that same week, several children in the area reported headaches and dizziness. Some said it was from fumes from the sawmill. Others whispered about something moving under the ground. In the Brannan home, small signs began to surface. The clock in the kitchen stopped every night at exactly 9:46. A mirror in the hallway split clean down the center during a windless evening. The youngest boy refused to sleep in his room, saying the walls breathed. Each morning, Eliza swept up small piles of sawdust that reappeared no matter how often she cleaned, gathering beneath the door frames as if the house were shedding itself from the inside. On December 5th, Dr. Samuel Linton visited after Eliza sent word that Harold was unwell. In his later notes, the doctor described Harold as alert but agitated, eyes bloodshot, complaining of headaches and a sound he alone could hear. The doctor stayed only a few minutes. He would later admit that the stillness in the rooms unsettled him and that the air had a strange metallic taste, faint but undeniable. 2 nights later, a blizzard swept across northern Michigan. The power flickered, and the town seemed to disappear beneath the storm. Somewhere in that darkness, Harold descended into the cellar once more. He took with him his lantern and a small hatchet, perhaps to repair something, or perhaps out of fear of what he might find. What happened next no one saw, but when authorities entered the house days later, they found the lantern shattered on the ground, the blade of the hatchet buried in the packed earth, and a single handprint, small and smudged, pressed into the soot near the wall. Upstairs, it appeared the rest of the family had waited for him, a meal sat unfinished on the table. The telephone, an old crank model shared by 3 houses on the line, hung with the receiver slightly off its hook. One neighbor later told the sheriff she heard static on the line that night, uneven bursts of sound, followed by what she described as breathing, like someone underwater. She thought it was interference from the storm and said nothing until after the family was gone. When morning came, the snow outside the Brannan house was smooth and untouched. The back door was bolted from within. The only sign of movement was a chair lying on its side near the dining table and a porcelain teacup broken neatly in 2. There were no footprints leading away, no trails through the snow, not even to the barn. When Sheriff Avery and his men arrived days later, they described the house as unnaturally still. Every object was in its place, yet something about the air felt wrong, too heavy, as though the rooms were holding their breath. The sheriff's report described a faint vibration that could be felt in the basement, a low hum that came and went without any source. The north wall was damp to the touch, though no water pipes ran beneath it. A thin film of black dust coated the cellar steps, metallic and cold. The search continued for weeks. They combed the woods, the riverbank, and the frozen lake. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence of escape. Theories shifted with the wind. Some said the family had fled during the night, driven mad by isolation or debt. Others whispered that Harold had uncovered something buried in the mill, something he brought home. When the sheriff sealed the house, he claimed it was only to preserve evidence, but others believed it was to contain whatever still lingered inside. The townspeople tried to move on, yet the house refused to fade from their thoughts. Children dared each other to approach it. Hunters reported hearing faint knocking from inside when the wind fell quiet. A few weeks later, during the thaw, a local boy found a cracked teacup in the woods behind the property, streaked with soot that tests later described as organic residue. It was logged as evidence, then quietly forgotten. Over the years that followed, explanations changed with each retelling. Some said the Brannans died of poisoning from their faulty furnace, their bodies somehow dissolved by the chemicals that leaked into the soil. Others believed something beneath the house, an old shaft or a pocket of gas, had opened and swallowed them whole. But there were also those who refused to look for science in the story. They said the house itself had taken them, absorbed them into its walls the way a forest reclaims its dead. By the time a journalist from Detroit arrived in 1946 to document the case, the Brannan house had already begun to sink into the earth. The doors were warped shut, and ivy crawled through the cracks of the siding. When the boards were pried away, the man described stepping into a room frozen in time, dust covering everything like snow, plates still on the table, the air motionless and cold. He wrote that the silence felt physical, pressing in from every direction. It was, he later said, as if the house had inhaled and never exhaled again. He left after 15 minutes and never returned. The article he published was brief, factual, almost hesitant, as though describing something that resisted language. The official explanation, carbon monoxide poisoning, possible burial under unstable ground, was neat, clinical, and unsatisfying. It didn't explain the missing bodies. It didn't explain why, when the state sealed the house again, the deputies outside swore they heard faint footsteps moving upstairs. In the years that followed, the town grew quieter about the Brannans. The story became a warning told to children who wandered too far from home. The woods reclaimed the road and the property fell off official maps. Yet even today, some claim that when the lake freezes solid and the wind drops, you can hear a low hum in the distance, coming from where the house still stands, a sound steady and patient, like something deep beneath the earth waiting to breathe again. In the days after the Brannan house was sealed, Alpena fell into a kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if the town itself had agreed not to speak too loudly. People went about their business, attending church, shoveling snow, repairing fences. But the conversations that once filled the streets now ended abruptly whenever someone mentioned the family. It wasn't fear of the unknown that silenced them, not exactly. It was the uneasy sense that the unknown had already come too close. At first, there was pity. The local paper printed a short notice calling the event a mysterious disappearance and asking anyone with information to step forward. A small service was held at St. Mary's Church, where Eliza used to sing. But as weeks passed and the ground froze solid again, that sympathy turned inward. People began locking their doors earlier. Curtains stayed drawn. Children were told not to wander past the old mill road. The Brannans had vanished, and in their absence, imagination did what fact could not. It filled every silence with possibility. Rumors spread quietly but persistently. Some said Harold had gone mad from the pressures of work, that he'd taken his family into the woods and met a desperate end. Others spoke of a sickness, something the government had ordered contained. The state's sudden involvement, the way men from Lansing arrived, took notes and left without a word, fueled those fears. For a small town that had always trusted what it could see and touch, this secrecy felt unnatural, almost cruel. The pastor, Reverend Cole, tried to bring calm. In one sermon, he spoke about the dangers of dwelling on the unseen, reminding his congregation that some mysteries were best left to God. Yet even he began to avoid the road near the Brannan property. Later, he would tell a parishioner that when he stood outside the sealed house, he felt as though someone were watching from inside. Though the windows had been nailed shut, the Dr. Samuel Linton suffered his own doubts. He was not a superstitious man, but his brief visit to the Brannan home stayed with him for years. He told colleagues in confidence that he sometimes woke at night, certain he could still smell the faint metallic scent that had hung in the family's cellar. When pressed, he admitted he no longer believed what he'd written in his report. "I said it was a case of mass hysteria," he confessed. But it felt more like the house was the one that went mad, not them. For the townspeople, the loss became a kind of mirror reflecting their own fragility. In 1938, communities like Alpena relied on stability, neighbors knowing neighbors, everyone accounted for, every story ending neatly. The Brannans shattered that illusion. They were good people, ordinary people, and yet they'd been erased without reason. That was what unsettled the town most. It suggested that disappearance wasn't reserved for the reckless or the cursed. It could happen to anyone. As the years passed, the story of the sealed house became part of local folklore, shifting shape with each retelling. Children dared each other to walk up to its door. Teenagers whispered about lights flickering in the windows. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to go near it. Farmers spoke of the ground trembling faintly beneath their boots when they passed by. Yet despite all this, no one ever saw a single thing move. It was as if the land itself carried the memory in silence, unwilling to let it fade. By the 1940s, when the war overseas dominated headlines, the Brannan disappearance had become a footnote in county records. But for the older generation, it never left their minds. When the lights flickered during winter storms, some would mutter, "That's the Brannan house again." The line between superstition and experience blurred. They didn't believe the dead walked there. Rather, they believed the house had absorbed something, a tension, a vibration, that refused to die. Psychologists today might call it collective trauma. In isolated towns where people depend on each other for stability, a shared mystery can spread like infection. The lack of closure becomes a wound that the community unconsciously protects. The residents of Alpena did just that. They stopped speaking of the Brannans in public, avoided their property, and pretended the incident was simply an unfortunate tragedy. But in their silence, they preserved it. In later decades, when journalists tried to revisit the story, they found an almost deliberate erasure. Records had gone missing. Witness statements were incomplete. The sheriff's office claimed the files were lost in a flood, though the archives showed no such damage. Some suspected a cover-up, but more likely it was an act of quiet mercy, an attempt to bury what could not be explained. Alpena had chosen to forget, not because it didn't care, but because remembering kept the fear alive. Even so, there were those who couldn't let go. A few surviving neighbors spoke to researchers in the 1970s. They recalled strange details: the sound of knocking in the nights after the house was sealed, a faint light glowing from the cracks of the boards, the way snow never seemed to settle evenly on its roof. They described the silence around the property as thick, a word that came up often, as though the air there was heavier than anywhere else. For a while, scientists tried to offer answers. Geologists pointed to underground vibrations caused by frost heaves. Chemists suggested that gases from decaying organic material could explain both the hum and the faint lights reported. But none of these theories explained the missing family or the complete absence of human remains. It was as though the Brannans had evaporated, consumed by an unseen process that left only emptiness behind. In that emptiness, the people of Alpena built meaning. The story of the Brannan family became a reminder of the thin boundary between order and chaos, between the safe routine of daily life and the cold void that could swallow it without warning. Each generation retold it differently, sometimes as a cautionary tale about pride, sometimes about isolation, sometimes about things buried beneath the earth that should never be disturbed. Yet, through all the versions, one sentiment remained unchanged: a deep, lingering respect for the mystery itself. No one vandalized the property. No one tore it down. Even as nature reclaimed the walls and the roof sank inward, the town left it untouched. To destroy it, they said, would be to invite whatever slept there back into the open. And so, the house remained. The road that once led to it faded into the forest, and the last people who had known the Brannans grew old and passed away. But their silence endured, inherited like an heirloom. To this day, some locals still say a prayer when they drive past the area, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what they cannot name, because the Brannan disappearance was more than a tragedy. It became part of Alpena's identity, a reminder that not every question has an answer and not every absence can be filled. The people didn't just lose a family, they lost a piece of certainty. In their attempt to understand, they uncovered something older and quieter, the possibility that mystery itself is alive, and that sometimes what vanishes does not leave a void, but a presence that waits patiently beneath the snow. The house stood in silence for nearly a decade before anyone dared to cross its threshold again. By the winter of 1947, the story of the Brannans had become a ghost tale told to frighten children, nothing more than local folklore. But to the few who still remembered, the unease had never lifted. When a sudden thaw revealed a partial collapse of the roof, the county finally decided to send a small team to assess the damage. They wanted to demolish it before it became a danger to wanderers or hunters. No one volunteered. The task fell to 3 men from the highway department, ordinary men used to dirt and heavy work, not superstition. They arrived early in the morning, when the fog still rolled low across the field. From a distance, the Brannan house looked smaller than anyone recalled, swallowed by vines and moss, its windows sealed behind warped boards. The men didn't speak much as they approached. One of them, Miller, said later that the quiet felt wrong, that even the birds avoided the air above it. They began by pulling at the boards near the front door, prying loose the rusted nails. The first crack of wood echoed like a gunshot across the clearing. Then came the smell. Not decay, not rot, but something older. A scent of iron, damp soil, and ash. Inside, the light barely touched the floor. The men used kerosene lamps, their flames trembling against the walls. The air was dense and cold, as if it hadn't moved in years. Dust floated in the beams of light, thick as mist. The living room was perfectly preserved, chairs still standing, dishes on the table, a clock frozen at 3:11. Everything looked as though the family had simply vanished mid-meal. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no human remains. Only a faint residue that shimmered on the wallpaper. Like frost, even though the room was warm, they found children's toys scattered across the floor. Marbles, a wooden doll, a tin soldier, and beside them, something stranger, concentric circles drawn into the dust, etched deeply enough to expose the wood beneath. Each one was the size of a dinner plate, almost perfectly round. One of the men laughed nervously, saying it was probably from mice or rats. Another noticed that the circles pulsed slightly in the lamplight, as though the wood itself was breathing. When they moved deeper into the house, the temperature dropped sharply. In the kitchen, water still sat in the sink, covered by a thin film that reflected their lamps like mirrors. On the stove were 3 empty pots, their metal warped as if exposed to heat long after the fire had died. The cellar door was nailed shut from the outside. It was there, Miller said, that they hesitated. Something behind that door made a sound, soft, deliberate, almost polite. A knock, just one. They thought it might be an animal. They pried the nails loose and opened it. The air that escaped was heavy, metallic, and warm. The lanterns flickered. Stairs descended into complete blackness. They called out but received no echo, as though the space below swallowed every word whole. Miller took the first step. The wood groaned beneath his weight. When his boot touched the dirt floor, the sound changed, less like a creak, more like a sigh. What they found in that cellar would never appear in any official report. The next morning, the county supervisor received only a brief note. Structure unstable. Recommend demolition. No salvageable materials. None of the 3 men ever returned to work. One moved out of state. One was found wandering the woods days later, unable to speak, hands raw as if he'd been digging in frozen soil. Miller disappeared entirely. His truck was discovered abandoned 2 miles down the road, engine running, driver's door open. Inside, on the seat, was his lantern, still burning. Rumors spread again, as they always did. Some said the men had found remains. Others claimed they'd uncovered something that wasn't human. One old farmer swore he'd seen a faint light glowing from beneath the house that night, a pale pulse like a heartbeat under the earth. When workers returned weeks later to demolish it, the foundation had sunk half a foot into the ground, as if the soil had softened only there. They brought in machines, but every engine stalled within yards of the property. Eventually, they gave up. The house was left to rot, its beams collapsing inward like a rib cage. In the following years, strange incidents continued. Campers reported hearing rhythmic tapping in the woods near the site. Snow melted faster around its perimeter, even in the coldest winters. One sheriff deputy, decades later, described seeing footprints that led directly to the sealed doorway and stopped. No return prints, no sign of retreat. Every attempt to investigate ended the same way: silence, unease, and a reluctance to talk about what anyone had seen. By the 1960s, scientists from a local university briefly examined the land. They discovered high concentrations of iron oxide and faint traces of radiation, though the levels were inconsistent, appearing and vanishing as if something beneath the soil pulsed in cycles. The lead researcher withdrew the project after one of his assistants fell ill. The records from that study were later misplaced. Local historians began calling it the sealed house phenomenon, linking it to other disappearances across the Midwest, families that had vanished under ordinary circumstances, leaving no trace, their homes abandoned but untouched. Most dismissed these connections as coincidence, yet the details were hauntingly similar: sealed doors, stopped clocks, a lingering odor of metal. The Brannon case, though, remained the oldest and most complete example. As decades passed, the house decayed but never fully collapsed. Visitors described hearing low vibrations, like a hum beneath the earth. Some reported vertigo, others said they felt the ground pulse faintly under their feet. Skeptics blamed suggestion, the power of myth, But those who spent longer than a few minutes there spoke of something subtler, the feeling that time itself bent slightly inside the property. That moment stretched or contracted without warning. When in the late 1980s, a new generation of thrill-seekers tried to document the site with cameras and tape recorders. Their footage captured nothing but static. Yet on playback, in the white noise, there were patterns, slow, rhythmic, like breathing. One frame showed what appeared to be a reflection of a man standing behind the lens, though the filmmaker was alone. His notes ended with one line: "The house listens." The state eventually fenced off the area, citing safety concerns. But those who live nearby still tell of hearing faint voices carried by the wind during autumn nights. They describe them as distant, overlapping, whispering not in words but in tones, low, resonant, mournful. A sound not meant for the living, or perhaps the echo of something that refuses to die. Even now, when fog rolls in thick over the field, the shape of the old foundation still appears, a dark square beneath the frost. Perfectly intact, though no structure remains. Locals say it's a trick of the land, that the cold air settles differently there. Others believe the Brannan family never truly vanished. They think the house closed around them, folding space in on itself, preserving whatever happened in a moment that continues to breathe beneath the soil. And so the story ends as it began, with silence and the faint scent of iron in the wind. The sealed house still stands in memory, half buried, half awake, waiting for someone foolish enough to open it again. By the following winter, the story of the sealed house had spread far beyond the borders of the small Michigan town. Newspapers from Detroit and Chicago sent reporters who lingered at the edges of the property, sketching the outline of the boarded windows and describing the scent of mold that seemed to hover in the snow. They quoted local men who spoke of curses, of a father who had lost his mind, of spirits that whispered through the chimney. But between those printed words and the quiet reality of the townsfolk, there was a deep divide. Inside the community, the disappearance had become something unspoken, an ache carried in glances, in hushed tones over dinner, in the way children were warned not to wander too far after sunset. The local pastor, Reverend Claymore, tried to turn the incident into a lesson on faith. In his Sunday sermons, he spoke about the fragility of the human mind and the need to protect the soul from isolation. He urged his congregation to pray for the missing family, though he carefully avoided using their names. To the older parishioners, this omission was polite restraint. To the younger ones, it only deepened the fear that naming them might summon something best left undisturbed. Doctors from neighboring counties were called to examine what little evidence remained. They studied the traces, rust-colored stains on the floorboards, the fragments of letters found near the hearth, the smell of something burnt that never entirely faded. Some believed the family had fallen victim to carbon monoxide poisoning, others to a collective psychosis triggered by starvation and paranoia. A psychologist from Lansing, writing for a medical journal in 1939, described it as an episode of voluntary withdrawal from reality, magnified by social isolation and the bleakness of the Depression era. The article was clinical, detached, yet beneath its language was a quiet horror, the recognition that entire families, under pressure and silence, could simply vanish into themselves. Neighbors began to reinterpret the smallest details of the months leading up to the disappearance. One woman recalled how Mrs. Langley had stopped attending the market, preferring to send her son instead. Another mentioned that the family dog had howled every night before it too went silent. These recollections grew and changed with each telling, shifting from observation to folklore. Soon no one could separate memory from invention. The sealed house had become a mirror for the town's own fears, poverty, shame, madness, and the relentless Michigan winter pressing down on wooden walls. As the years passed, the property was sold, though no one ever moved in. Teenagers dared each other to peek through the cracks of its warped boards, swearing they saw shadows moving inside. One local teacher, fascinated by the case, used it as an example in her lectures about mass hysteria and collective trauma. She argued that the Langley family had become victims of a broader sickness, one rooted in the loneliness of rural life during the Great Depression. In small towns like theirs, where every face was familiar and privacy was rare, silence could be both protection and poison. In 1941, a traveling journalist revisited the site. He described the air around the cabin as still and heavy, as though time itself refused to pass there. He interviewed townspeople who still flinched at the mention of the Langleys, recording their fragmented testimonies. One man swore he had heard knocking from inside the house on a windless night. Another claimed that a light flickered once a year in the upstairs window, always on the same date, the night they disappeared. When the article was published, it reignited public fascination. Yet, despite the renewed attention, no definitive answer ever surfaced. By the 1950s, the sealed house had shifted from tragedy to legend. Parents used it to warn children about the dangers of curiosity, and local folklore cast the Langleys as restless spirits guarding their own secret. Folklorists from the University of Michigan documented the tale as part of a study on regional ghost stories, though they noted how distinct it was from others. Unlike tales of vengeful hauntings or demonic possession, this one was quiet. Its terror lay not in violence, but in the absence of explanation. Even today, the townspeople who remember their grandparents' stories speak of the sealed house with a kind of reverence. The house still stands, half swallowed by vines and silence, its windows covered in iron sheets instead of boards now. No one lives nearby, and the local authorities stopped maintaining the road that leads to it. Yet every few years, someone new stumbles upon the story, a historian, a ghost hunter, a curious traveler, and the questions return. What could drive an entire family to vanish within their own home? Why did no one hear them go? Perhaps the most haunting reaction came not from the locals, but from those who studied the psychological aftermath. Decades later, sociologists revisiting Depression-era Michigan found a pattern of withdrawal in rural families. Small clusters of people who, facing economic ruin and social isolation, shut themselves away, refusing visitors, living in silence until they disappeared from record. Some re-emerged years later in other towns, under new names. Others, like the Langleys, left nothing behind but locked doors and speculation. The town has changed, but the silence remains. On autumn evenings, when fog curls low over the ground, the outline of the house still looms, a reminder of what fear and loneliness can do when left to grow in the dark. And so the community continues to react, not with words, but with distance. They do not touch the past. They only live beside it, as if acknowledging it might invite it to return.